All right, but let's look at the, so this is the first area, the first topic area, which is the global outlook. And a lot of words on here. Again, I'll sort of zip through some of them fairly quickly. I think they're a little maybe hard to read especially from the back of the room. But I think our view right now is the stage is set for a modest recovery in the global economy, but that it will be driven not by the emerging world, but what I will call for the last time now, because I don't want to bore you, what I call the dull old economies, which is to say the U.S., the UK, Japan, and Germany. Now, one of my colleagues, Sarah Johnson, doesn't like the term dull old applied to the United States, and I agree. But it's a figure of speech. I think there's a lot of dynamism in this economy and some of the others. So the U.S., interestingly enough, is growing, and despite the sequester. And it is set to strengthen. Our view is the U.S. growth will pick up as this year sort of ends and as next year begins. Europe, good news is, as Anurag mentioned, the six-quarter recession is over. Now, whether growth will be broad-based is a debatable point. Probably not. Japan, bright spot in the global economy. It's the fastest growing of the G7. The first half of this year, it grew 4%. So very, very positive. China, a lot of worries about China. China's growth slowing down quite a bit. Good news is recent evidence is growth has stabilized. Again, there are lots of challenges ahead, but at least it doesn't look like it's getting any worse than it is right now. It's stabilized sort of somewhere in the mid-sevens. Now, a lot of countries would love to have 7.5% growth, except that just a few years ago, China had 10.5% growth. So it's a come down for China. The real worry is about many of the other emerging markets. Not only have they been hit recently by financial turmoil around Fed tapering, I'll say more about that in a few minutes. So there's been that. There's been a huge flight of capital from these economies. Their exchange rates have been hammered. Their stock markets have been hit. But behind that is a 2-year deceleration in growth, which really is scary. You've had Indian growth go from about over 10% to around 3%. You've had Brazilian growth from 7.5% to 0.5% growth. Those are stunning changes that have nothing to do with Fed tapering, nothing to do with financial turmoil. There's something else going on here, which we'll delve into. In this environment, commodity prices, by and large, going nowhere, except for oil, but oil has mostly been driven up and down because of geopolitics. Beyond that, I think our view in terms of the medium-term, or at least outlook for oil, is down. Again, there'll be a lot of discussion about that during this conference. Inflation, interest rates will remain mostly low, with a few exceptions in the emerging world. So you put all that together, and you've got basically a recovery that will, at least for the next year or two, be driven by the developed world, which is, again, a turn of events. This is not what people would have said a year or two ago. They would have said something entirely different. Now, there is good news out there. These are the so-called PMIs, the Purchasing Managers Indexes, and you've got the U.S., Eurozone, China, and Japan on here. And really what matters here is all the way on the right. Notice that just about all those lines are above the threshold of 50. That demarcates expansion. This is the manufacturing. Expansion versus contraction. And the biggest rise is the U.S. The U.S. manufacturers are very optimistic right now. And so a lot going on in the U.S. Anurag talked a little bit about it. I'll spend some time on it, but we'll have a session this afternoon on the U.S. But even a lot of the other key economies, we've seen a significant improvement, not only in manufacturing. If you look at the services PMIs, business confidence, they too have done very well. So the good news is the incoming data, and these are forward-looking in the sense that this is about optimism, about what you're going to do, what businesses are going to do. This is very, very positive. So our view right now is that this is the pattern of growth. This is global growth. That's the solid blue bars. And then the line there, the orange line, is industrial production. Again, growth in industrial production. And you can see that we came roaring out of the Great Recession, as it's been called, but then things tapered off. We think that's temporary, having a lot to do with the deleveraging process that's going on in the U.S. and Europe, and certainly the slowdown in the emerging world more recently. But we think that's about to come to an end, and I'll try to sort of motivate that going forward. But so pulling this apart a little bit, again, this slide may be a little hard to read from the back of the room, but I'll go through this with you. From left to right, these are the regions of the world, and these are data from 2010 to 2015, and then there's the last bar is an average of 2016 to 2020. And you've got NAFTA, other Americas, Western Europe, emerging Europe, Middle East, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Japan, and other Asia Pacific. A couple of points to be made here. Just about all the emerging regions, we've seen a deceleration in growth. Again, I'll try to give you reasons behind that in the past in a couple of minutes. If you look at NAFTA all the way on the left, that's dominated by the U.S. What's really surprising is how almost stable that growth has been. It's up, down, up, down. Now, we think it'll have a decisive up in the next couple of years. But it hasn't collapsed, for example, the same way that growth has in Japan or in Europe. It's been a very different story. It's actually been remarkably stable, as my colleague Doug Handler will talk about this afternoon, in the face of multiple shocks. The U.S. has been hit with a lot of shocks. The debt ceiling, the fiscal cliff, the sequester, European crisis, on and on and on. And we've kept going. And that's a legacy of the strength of this economy. But if you notice that all these sets of bars, in the first part of each of them, there's, from the blue bar on down, there's quite a decline in many of the regions of the world. So that's the backdrop. Just a few more sort of global slides, and again, we'll have more of this in subsequent sessions. This is commodity prices. This is the history, and you can see a lot of volatility, especially after the Great Recession, which was that big dip. A lot of bouncing around, but no clear trend. And I think our view is going forward, and this has the forecast of the IHS Commodity Price Index in here. Again, no real clear trend, maybe just edging downward. A lot of that having to do with the fact that China, which had a huge voracious appetite for raw materials, has slowed. So there'll be some downward pressure as a result of that. A very similar pattern on some of the energy stories, although it's a more complicated picture. I'm not going to be able to do justice to it right here, but we'll have lots and lots of sessions on this. For the U.S., the big positive is natural gas, in the sense that we've had a big decline in natural gas prices thanks to the unconventional gas boom. Similar but not as big effect on the oil side. We do think that despite what's going on right now in terms of uncertainties about Syria and so on, that the medium-term outlook for oil is down, at least slightly down, mostly because of the improved oil production in the U.S. I'll say a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So we're not getting a lot of pressure on prices from commodities. There's a lot of slack out there in the world, a lot of excess capacity. So inflation is not a problem. And again, here are these regions of the world that we had before: NAFTA, other Americas, Western Europe, emerging Europe, Middle East Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Japan, and other Asia. Just about every single region, either inflation is low or has fallen. There's only one region in this graph where inflation recently has risen and may continue to rise, and that's the Middle East and North Africa, for a variety of reasons, which we don't need to get into right now. Some of it having to do with the Arab Spring and the convulsions around the Arab Spring. So inflation, by and large, at a global level, really not a serious threat, although it is important to show that some regions, inflation is 6%, whereas in the U.S. it's between 1.5% and 2%. So different levels of inflation, but by and large, very tame. And what that does is it means, certainly in the developed world, this is the pattern of interest rates. These are the policy interest rates. This is the interest rates set by the Fed, set by the European Central Bank, Bank of England, Bank of Japan. And they're going to stay essentially in the basement for the foreseeable future, for at least another year. Because inflation is not and probably will not be a problem for another year or two. Slightly different story when we get to the emerging world. here, a couple of countries have started to raise interest rates because they're worried about capital flight, because they're worried about their exchange rates getting hit. So, for example, we've had Brazil, we've had South Africa, not South Africa, sorry, Indonesia raise interest rates because they're extremely worried about their currency. They want to prevent the flight of capital. I mean, the logic being you raise your interest rate, people find your assets more attractive, so capital doesn't flee as quickly. That's the logic. But we have seen recently a number of emerging markets raise rates in response to what's happened really since May, since the whole Fed tapering kind of discussion. Another manifestation of this worry in emerging markets is exchange rates. This is the change in exchange rates since the beginning of the year. Basically, it's January to August. And some of them truly got hammered. Okay, Venezuela, you sort of say, well, they're a basket case. But you look at some of the other ones, Argentina, South Africa, India, Brazil. Again, they're kind of hard to read from the top, but I'll just go through the first 5 or 6. Top one, as I said, Venezuela, then Argentina, South Africa, India, Brazil, Turkey, Peru, Russia. All of them seeing drops in the exchange rate between 10% and 15%, basically from May on. Those are big changes in exchange rate. So a lot of panic. This is call it the emerging market panic, or sometimes referred to as the taper panic in anticipation of Fed tightening. What's happened is that the emerging markets have borne the brunt of this adjustment, and the concern that the U.S. In time will start to tighten monetary policy.